Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into an absolutely fascinating ethnopharmacological detective story. We're going to trace how one single plant shaped the political legitimacy of ancient empires over thousands of years.
We've got a lot of ground to cover today. We're looking at the ChangCao historical anomaly, the chemistry behind divine possession, the true identity of the continental Wa, some wild evidence from the Yanghai tombs, the evolution of Shinto rituals, and finally, the Japanese pharmacopoeia. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The ChangCao Historical Anomaly, a Geopolitical Paradox. Now, to really wrap our heads around this subject, we have to look through the rigorous academic lens of ethnopharmacology. This is the study of how diverse groups traditionally used plants for medicine and rituals and the actual pharmacology behind it. We're not just swapping ancient myths here, right? We're looking at real physical botany and the profound chemical effects these plants had on human consciousness and, frankly, on society itself. So here's where the mystery begins. There's this massive historical paradox in an ancient text called the Lunheng. It talks about a tribute given to King Cheng of the Zhou dynasty way back around 1042 BCE. The text explicitly says the Wa people offered a special herb called ChangCao. But here's the catch. According to the established historical and archaeological records we have, the Wa people of the Japanese archipelagos weren't officially documented by Chinese historians until roughly 1,000 years later, during the Han Dynasty. So you have to ask yourself, who exactly were these Wa people offering up this mysterious plant? Moving on to Section 2, Chemistry of Divine Possession, the Pharmacological Mechanism. This is where the ChangCao equals cannabis hypothesis comes into play, and the genius of their ancient empirical chemistry is just mind-blowing. Researchers strongly suspect ChangCao was actually high-THC cannabis. Now, the psychoactive compounds in cannabis, the cannabinoids, are lipophilic. That means they don't dissolve in water. So to extract them, they needed an organic solvent. Enter ethanol, conveniently found in black millet wine. They'd steep the resinous cannabis in the wine, and when it was orally ingested, the THC went straight through first-pass liver metabolism, converting into a potent compound called 11-hydroxy-THC. And that specific metabolic process, it triggers an incredibly intense, prolonged hallucinatory trance. So what does this all mean for the ancient kings? Well, this divine possession wasn't magic. It was a highly advanced botanical technology. By monopolizing the extraction of this specific plant into a powerful psychoactive tincture, these ancient elites could literally commune with the gods on demand. This intense trance state was the ultimate psychological and physical proof to their subjects that they had the absolute right to rule. It was the biological anchor for their political legitimacy. Pretty incredible, right? Section 3, Identity of Continental Wa, the Keepers of Botanical Knowledge. Okay, let's clear up that historical paradox we talked about earlier. The Wa who offered that tribute to King Cheng, they were not from Japan. Instead, they were a distinct continental group with profound ethnobotanical expertise living right there on the Asian continent. Today, tracing the ethnology and linguistics points us directly to their descendants, the modern Yi people, an ethnic minority who live in the rugged, mountainous regions of southwestern China. These continental Yi actually belongs to the Dong Yi macro group, or Eastern barbarians. And this is fascinating because the Dong Yi were closely tied to the lineage of Shen Nong, literally the legendary founder of agriculture and medicine in ancient China. They preserved a highly sophisticated framework for botanical science and crop domestication. So why are their descendants, the Yi people, isolated in remote mountains today? Well, over centuries of violent, bloody dynastic revolutions on the continent, these keepers of advanced botanical knowledge were displaced, pushed out to the extreme mountainous margins of the empire. Which brings us to Section 4, Evidence from Yanghai tombs. Physical proof in the Gobi. 789 grams. I want you to just take a second to process that number. That is the staggering amount of exceptionally preserved, selectively bred cannabis that archaeologists pulled out of a 2,700-year-old tomb right in the middle of the Gobi Desert. This massive ancient stash was uncovered in the Yanghai tombs near Turpan, and the tomb itself belonged to a highly esteemed 45-year-old shaman. Get this, he was an Indo-European with Caucasoid features and blue eyes belonging to the nomadic Gushi tribe. He was buried with incredibly valuable ritual items, including a harp and equestrian gear. This completely confirms that an extensive, highly sophisticated network of psychoactive plant use was thriving right across the heart of ancient Eurasia. But here is the absolute scientific smoking gun. When modern researchers took this 2,700-year-old plant material into a lab, they didn't just find standard hemp used for making ropes. No, they found the specific enzyme responsible for synthesizing THC, These ancient cultivators had deliberately removed the male plants and the low-potency stems. They were practicing systematic, highly specialized selective breeding strictly to maximize those medicinal and divinatory properties. It just proves the sheer depth of botanical mastery that existed in the region and fed into these ancient courts.
All right, Section 5, Shinto Rituals and Evolution, Cultural Transmission to Japan.
So as those violent dynastic shifts destabilized the continent, the highest elites protecting this botanical and cultural knowledge eventually migrated across the sea to the Japanese archipelago. And upon reaching Japan, this whole ideological framework underwent an absolutely wondrous cultural transmission. The primary use of this potent plant completely shifted. Instead of being ingested to induce a chemical trance, it was elevated into the absolute core instrument of Shinto purification. It transitioned from an internal hallucination to a tool for external spiritual cleansing of defilement. You can actually see this institutional foundation perfectly preserved in Japanese rituals to this day. For example, during the Daijosai, which is the most esoteric of the emperor's enthronement rituals, a sacred cannabis cloth called the arate is specially woven and offered. It acts as the physical, botanical endorsement of the monarchy's legitimacy. We also see it in the o-nusa, those ritual purification wands swung by Shinto priests that traditionally use hemp, and the shide, the zigzag streamers originally crafted from hemp branches. The plant literally became the fabric of spiritual purity. Finally, Section 6, the Japanese Pharmacopoeia, from feudal weapons to modern medicine. This timeline maps out an unbelievable evolution on the Japanese archipelago. We go from the sacred arate cloth of ancient enthronement rituals to the exact same plant's chemical properties being adapted for feudal psychological warfare, then formally cataloged as botanical therapeutics, and eventually formally integrated into officially recognized modern medicine. It's just absolutely fascinating when you trace it out. In 1676, the famous ninja manual, the Ben Senshukai, detailed how to create a hoyaku, or fool's medicine, from dried cannabis leaves to induce acute dissociation. Yes, ninjas were literally getting their enemies too high to fight. Then, during the Edo period, the renowned naturalist Hiken Kaibara documented its genuine therapeutic efficacy for treating severe malaria chills in his work, the Yamato Honzo. And incredibly, right up until the post-war era, from 1886 to 1951, it was officially listed in the Japanese Pharmacopoeia as Indian cannabis, used by modern doctors as a powerful sedative and hypnotic to induce deep sleep. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. We've traced the incredible journey of a single plant, from the high courts of the Zhou dynasty to the blue-eyed shamans of the Gobi Desert, and all the way to the sacred shrines and modern pharmacies of Japan. It really sparks a massive question. If one plant can legitimize empires, shape sacred rites, and weave its way into modern medicine, what other hidden botanical forces have silently steered the course of human civilization, just waiting to be uncovered? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next one.
You know, usually when we talk about history, there is this underlying expectation of precision. We treat it like a medical diagnosis or an anatomical diagram.
Right, like an X-ray.
Exactly. You break your arm, the X-ray shows this jagged white fracture, and the doctor points to the film and just says, there is the event. There is the break.
And we naturally want the timeline of human civilization to behave the exact same way.
We really do. We want the pottery shard to correspond perfectly to the carbon date. We want this pristine binary narrative of what happened and when.
Because we crave that visible categorization. I mean, it provides a comforting illusion of control over the past, We prefer our historical epochs to fit neatly onto a linear timeline that we can just memorize.
Right, totally devoid of all the chaotic variables of human biology and, well, subjective experience. But to everyone listening today, welcome to the deep dive. Because the moment you step into the world of ancient pharmacobotany, the history of how early human beings interacted with, selectively bred, and consumed powerful psychoactive plants, that pristine X-ray machine just completely shatters.
It really does.
Yeah.
We are no longer looking at a clean fracture. We are stepping into a historical landscape that is incredibly murky.
And it's murky largely because we aren't just tracking the physical movement of seeds across a geographic map.
No, we're tracking the deliberate manipulation of human consciousness. I mean, we are examining deeply guarded botanical rituals, the engineering of religious experiences, and the ancient state secrets used to legitimize absolute political power.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The evidence isn't always a stone monument. Sometimes the evidence is a highly specific 3,000-year-old chemical reaction documented in a marginalized text.
And today, we are unpacking a historical and scientific paradox hidden entirely within one of those texts. It's a 3,000-year-old court tribute.
A really bizarre one at that.
Yeah, and to figure this out, we are pulling from a massive stack of sources for this deep dive. Ancient Chinese philosophical records, modern archaeobotanical DNA sequencing from the Turpan Basin, classical Japanese medical encyclopedias, and even covert assassination manuals from the 17th century.
It's quite the list.
It is. And the mission today is to trace the journey of a single, highly potent plant through all of this.
A journey that completely dismantles our conventional understanding of ancient Eurasian geography. I mean, it challenges the presumed origins of early clinical medicine, and it really forces us to reconsider the foundational practices of some of the world's oldest enduring spiritual traditions.
The premise alone is staggering. We have to connect a bizarre offering of a plant known as ChangCao, presented to an ancient Chinese king, to a blue-eyed, Tocharian-speaking shaman buried in the freezing arid sands of the Gobi Desert.
Right?
And then we have to follow that same botanical lineage across the sea to the sacred, pristine purification rituals of Japanese Shinto, and eventually into the covert psychological warfare tactics employed by feudal ninjas.
It sounds like fiction, but it's not. The intersection of botany, pharmacology, and imperial ambition here, it feels like uncovering a massive, invisible infrastructure that has literally been shaping human history for millennia.
Absolutely. Because we're looking at how ancient humanity utilized complex organic chemistry.
Thousands of years before the formalization of the scientific method, mind you.
Right. To achieve what appeared to be supernatural results. They wielded this plant to manufacture divine mandates, to construct entire socio-religious frameworks from the ground up, and to lay the empirical groundwork for what would eventually become the modern pharmacopoeia.
So we really should ground this in the primary source material first.
Yeah, let's do that. The foundational document we are dealing with here is the Linheng. It's a sweeping philosophical and historical text written around the year 80 CE by the Han Dynasty scholar Wang Chong.
And Wang Chong is a really critical figure here.
How so?
Well, he was essentially a rationalist and a skeptic. The Lunheng, which roughly translates to discourse's weight in the balance, was basically his attempt to critically evaluate the superstitions, the myths, and the historical accounts of his era.
So he wasn't just writing down fairy tales.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wasn't prone to recording mere rumors without a critical lens, which makes the specific historical event he documents in Chapter 58 so incredibly compelling.
Right, because he reaches back roughly 1,000 years before his own time, recording an event from the reign of King Cheng, the second king of the Zhou dynasty. We're placing this squarely between 1042 and 1021 BCE.
Over 3,000 years ago.
Yeah. And Wang Chong describes this grand assembly at the Zhou court where peripheral tribes arrived to offer tributes to the new king. He mentions a group called the Yucham who offered white pheasants. But another group, explicitly identified as the Raw people, offered a botanical tribute called ChangCao.
And that word ChangCao translates to something akin to the fragrant herb or the free-flowing herb.
The name alone suggests it's a plant known for its smell or its effects, right?
Yes, but the court records and subsequent commentaries are intensely specific about how this plant was meant to be utilized. It was not presented as just some visual ornament.
Okay, let's unpack this. What did they actually do with it?
The ChangCao was ritually steeped into a specialized wine brewed from black millet.
So they made an infusion, a dark aromatic drink called Chang.
Precisely. And consuming this specific infused wine was the catalyst for a profound biological and political event. The ancient texts describe the resulting state as kamigakari, or divine possession.
Wait, divine possession?
Yes. The drinker, usually the king, or the officiating high priests, entered a state where they were perceived to be physically inhabited by and directly communing with ancestral spirits and the gods themselves.
So they drank this stuff and just looked like they were talking to spirits.
Right. But if we strip away the mystical terminology and examine this through the lens of modern ethnopharmacology, divine possession is basically the cultural interpretation of a severe, chemically induced, altered state of consciousness.
So they were tripping.
They were absolutely tripping. And the prevailing, overwhelmingly supported hypothesis based on the botanical descriptions, the chemical processing, and the physiological outcomes is that the ChangCao tribute was cannabis.
Over 3,000 years ago, cannabis was presented as a high-level royal tribute designed to induce hallucinations. That is wild.
It is. But the specific method of preparation, steeping it in black millet wine, is what reveals an astonishing level of ancient empirical science.
Why is the wine part so important? I mean, couldn't they just make tea out of it?
No, and that's the brilliant part. If you take a handful of raw cannabis and boil it in water to make a tea, the physiological effect is virtually zero.
Really? Zero effect.
Pretty much. The primary psychoactive compound in cannabis, delta-9-tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is a highly nonpolar molecule.
Meaning what exactly?
It means it's lipophilic and hydrophobic. It hates water and binds to fats and alcohols. If the ancient zoo court had simply boiled the ChangCao in water, the resinous trichomes that house the cannabinoids would have remained largely intact.
Oh, because the water can't break them down.
Exactly. The water cannot break down and bind to the active compounds. An aqueous extraction of raw cannabis yields basically no psychoactive results.
So they somehow deduced the absolute necessity of an organic solvent.
They bypass the limitation entirely by using black millet wine. The ethanol present in the fermented wine serves as a highly efficient organic solvent.
So when they soak the leaves in the wine.
When the resin-heavy leaves and female floral clusters of the cannabis plant are submerged in ethanol, the solvent degrades the glandular trichomes. It strips the lipophilic cannabinoids from the plant material, suspending them seamlessly within the liquid tincture.
It's like these ancient priests were the world's first empirical pharmacologists. But here is what I don't get. How did they figure out the exact chemical solvent to use thousands of years before the concept of chemistry even existed?
Through generations of observation, trial, and error, these early pharmacologists engineered a method to fully extract and concentrate the plant's psychoactive payload.
They were performing advanced botanical extractions in bronze ritual vessels? That's incredible.
It is. Furthermore, the decision to ingest the tincture orally, rather than burning and inhaling the plant, fundamentally alters the pharmacokinetics.
You mean how the human body processes it?
Right. The ingestion route is the crucial mechanism here. Inhalation delivers THC across the alveolar membranes in the lungs directly into the bloodstream, reaching the brain's CB1 receptors in seconds.
So smoking it is fast.
Very fast onset, but the duration is relatively brief, and the molecular structure of the THC remains largely unchanged during this initial delivery.
But drinking the black millet wine tincture reroutes that whole process.
Completely. The infused liquid enters the gastrointestinal tract, absorbing through the mucosal lining of the stomach and intestines.
And then it goes to the liver.
Right, yes. From there, it enters the portal vein, which carries it directly to the liver before it ever reaches the general circulation. This physiological detour is known as first-pass metabolism.
Okay, so what does the liver do to the THC?
When the liver encounters delta-9-THC, its cytochrome P450 enzymes immediately begin to metabolize the foreign substance. The liver essentially cleaves the molecule and adds a hydroxyl group.
Which transforms it.
Exactly. It transforms the delta-9-THC into a distinct, highly potent metabolite known as 11-hydroxy-THC.
Okay, so imagine delta-9-THC as a key that loosely fits into the locks of your central nervous system. First-pass metabolism doesn't destroy the key. The liver basically takes it and files down the ridges, shaping it into a master key 11-hydroxy-THC.
That's a great way to look at it, and that master key possesses a vastly superior binding affinity.
Because it fits the locks better.
Right, because 11-hydroxy-THC is more polar. It crosses the blood-brain barrier with remarkable efficiency, binding aggressively to the CB1 receptors in the brain.
So the effects are totally different from just smoking it.
Wildly different. The user experiences intense, overwhelming dissociation, heavy somatic sensations, altered temporal perception, and profound auditory and visual hallucinations.
A massive, intense trip.
Yes. And crucially, the half-life of this metabolite extends the duration of the trance for many, many hours.
So just visualize the environment of the zoo court during this ritual for a second. You've got these heavy bronze vessels, the dense smoke of incense in the room, the sharp fermented aroma of the black millet wine.
The setting alone would be overwhelming.
Right. And then the officiating priest, or the king, consumes this potent 11-hydroxy-THC tincture. An hour later, the first-pass metabolism peaks.
Their eyes roll back.
Yeah, their body sways or goes completely rigid. They start speaking in unintelligible tongues, reporting visions of the ancestral realm.
To the uninitiated observers in the court, the ruler has quite literally left the mortal plane.
It's brilliant. It's a brilliant application of pharmacology to cement authority.
The political utility of this biochemical reaction really cannot be overstated. The Zhou dynasty, like many ancient regimes, relied entirely on the concept of the mandate of heaven to legitimize their rule.
So it wasn't enough to just have a big army.
No, a king couldn't merely possess a larger military. He had to demonstrate visible, indisputable proof that the cosmos endorsed his authority. By engineering this specific pharmacological trance, the ruling class manufactured tangible, biological proof of their divine connection.
The Kamigakari state was essentially a biochemical weapon of mass political legitimization.
Exactly.
However, when we scrutinize the historical records detailing this tribute, we run into a severe chronological paradox. And this is fascinating. The Lunhang attributes the ChangCao tribute to the Hua people during King Cheng's reign in 1042 BCE, right?
That's what the text says, yes.
The standard historical maps place the Hua people exclusively on the Japanese archipelago.
Which is the profound issue here. The inhabitants of the archipelago were not formally recorded by Chinese historians until the Book of Han, which covers the Western Han period, roughly between 200 BCE and the year 8 CE.
We are looking at a gap of an entire millennium.
1,000 years, yes.
So we either have to conclude that Wang Chong fabricated the name of the tribe out of thin air, or our fundamental understanding of ancient geography and the migratory patterns of these groups is deeply flawed.
Right, because the Hua people delivering tributes to the Zhou court in the 11th century BCE could not have been traveling from the Japanese islands at that time.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Who were they then?
The linguistic and ethnological evidence points toward a much more complex reality, the existence of a continental Hua population.
A continental Hua.
Yes. Through rigorous phonetic tracking of ancient tribal names and localized cultural practices, historians and anthropologists have drawn a direct line between these ancient continental Hua and the modern-day Yi people.
Okay, and the Yi people are currently recognized as an ethnic minority residing predominantly in the highly rugged mountainous terrains of southwestern China, right?
Yes, specifically in the provinces of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou. Historically, the various branches of this group were documented under names that share strong phonetic and cultural linkages to the ancient Hua or Yi tribal designations.
So if we accept that the ancestors of the Yi people, who were part of the broader cultural umbrella often referred to as the Dongyi, or Eastern barbarians, were the ones possessing this advanced botanical technology, we must fundamentally reevaluate the power dynamics of ancient East Asia.
We absolutely must, because the term Dongyi was a pejorative exonym. It was utilized by the Huaxia people of the Central Plains to marginalize any culture existing outside their immediate sphere of influence.
One's calling them barbarian.
Right. The label barbarian implies a lack of sophistication, a primitive society surviving on the fringes of true civilization.
Yet these supposedly primitive people were the ones supplying the Zhou dynasty with the precise, selectively bred pharmacological tools required to interface with the divine.
Exactly. It suggests that the technological flow of information was moving from the periphery into the center, not the other way around.
If the Dongyi were actually the architects of ancient agriculture and medicine, doesn't that completely flip the script on how we view the center versus the periphery of ancient civilization?
It flips it completely. And a deep reading of the foundational myths of Chinese civilization actually supports this inversion.
Really? How so?
The mythological framework relies on figures known as the Three Sovereigns. They are the legendary architects of human society. The most prominent among them concerning agriculture is Shennong.
The human sovereign.
Yes, Shennong, the mythological father of both farming and medicine. And Shennong is explicitly and repeatedly linked in classical texts to the Dongyi lineage.
Wow. The legends depict Shennong tasting hundreds of herbs, poisoning himself, and discovering their medicinal or toxic properties through agonizing trial and error.
Which is essentially the cultural memory of a deeply empirical, generations-long scientific process. It implies that the deepest, most sophisticated knowledge of plant domestication, the selective breeding of rice, and complex pharmacognosy originated in the eastern and southern coastal regions.
The ancestral homelands of the Dongyi and the Sanyao cultures.
Precisely. The Huaxia people in the Central Plains absorbed this botanical mastery, utilizing it to build their agricultural surplus and religious frameworks.
So what happened to the Dongyi then?
The tragedy of the Dongyi lineage lies in the brutal realities of ancient geopolitics. The history of the continent is defined by endless, violent dynastic successions, what the ancient historians termed revolutions changing the mandate.
Right. Whenever a new martial power consolidated control over the Central Plains, the existing power structures and peripheral cultures faced a stark choice.
Utter assimilation or violent displacement.
And the ancestors of the Yi people possessed unparalleled agrarian and pharmacological wisdom, but they lacked the sheer concentrated military infrastructure of the expanding central dynasties.
Consequently, they were subjected to a slow, centuries-long process of marginalization. They were systematically pushed out of the fertile plains and river valleys.
Forced to retreat into the harsh, easily defensible mountain ranges of the Southwest.
Yes, and they carried their profound ancestral knowledge of plants with them into this geographical exile, preserving the botanical framework that once dictated the religion of empires.
Now, the narrative of advanced cannabis cultivation by these ancient peripheral tribes might seem entirely dependent on interpreting old texts and mythological lineages.
It might seem that way, but it's not.
Right, because the archaeobotanical record provides staggering physical validation of this ancient agricultural sophistication. The proof isn't merely textual. It was entombed and perfectly desiccated in one of the most unforgiving environments on the planet.
We really must shift our focus to the Turpan Basin in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of modern-day China.
Specifically the Yunghai Tombs, which is this massive ancient cemetery situated right in the arid expanse of the Gobi Desert.
The specific environmental conditions of the Turpan Basin are crucial here.
Because it's so dry.
Exactly. It is one of the driest, hottest places on Earth during the summer, with freezing, moistureless winters. This extreme aridity acts as a natural desiccator. It completely halts the bacterial decomposition that usually reclaims organic matter.
So it's basically a giant freeze dryer.
Yes. And because of this, when archaeologists excavated tomb number 90, they didn't just find dust and bone. They found an intact window into the year 700 BCE.
And Tomb 90 is a profound archaeological anomaly.
It truly is. The occupant was a 45-year-old male, but his biological profile does not match the typical populations of the Central Plains.
He was a Caucasoid individual with blue eyes of Indo-European descent.
Right. Extensive analysis suggests he belonged to the Gushi people, a nomadic pastoralist tribe known to inhabit the region who spoke Tocharian,
which is a now extinct branch of the Indo-European language family. The presence of a blue-eyed Tocharian-speaking man in the Gobi Desert nearly 3 millennia ago highlights the vast, porous nature of ancient human migration.
And the grave goods carefully arranged around his body clearly designated him as a shaman.
A spiritual conduit and medical practitioner for his community.
Yes. He was interred with a beautifully carved kongu harp, an instrument utilized in ritualistic ceremonies, and an elaborate leather makeup bag.
But the most significant artifact was positioned near his head.
The excavators found a meticulously woven leather basket, and inside that basket rested a carved wooden bowl, which contained roughly 789 grams, almost 2 full pounds, of incredibly well-preserved, bright green, dried plant material.
Given the sheer volume of the material, the initial assumption by some observers was that this was just wild hemp, right? I mean, hemp has been utilized across Eurasia for thousands of years as a crucial industrial fiber for weaving coarse textiles, making rope, producing paper.
That was the assumption. But to determine the exact nature of the plant, the archaeological team employed rigorous anti-contamination protocols to extract samples.
And they sent those off for testing.
They were subsequently transported to a specialized pharmacognosy laboratory in the United Kingdom. The researchers engaged in a painstaking 10-month-long microscopic and genetic analysis.
10 months just to analyze some dried leaves.
Because they weren't just looking at the physical structure of the leaves, they were sequencing the degraded ancient DNA, or aDNA, to understand the plant's biosynthetic capabilities.
And extracting and sequencing aDNA from a 2,700-year-old specimen has got to be an incredibly delicate process.
Highly delicate. It's fraught with the risk of modern exogenous contamination. But the results they isolated were definitive.
What did they find?
They mapped the genetic markers and confirmed the presence of a specific crucial enzyme, THCA synthesase.
THCA synthase. Why is that the definitive biochemical smoking gun?
To understand why, we have to look at the biosynthetic pathway of the cannabis plant. All cannabis plants produce a precursor molecule called cannabigerolic acid, or CBGA.
Okay, CBGA.
In industrial hemp varieties grown for fiber, specific enzymes convert the CBGA primarily into non-psychoactive compounds, like CBDA.
Right, the stuff that doesn't get you high.
Exactly. However, in psychoactive strains, the plant utilizes THCA synthase to catalyze the conversion of CBGA into tetrahydrocannabinolic acid, or THCA.
And THCA is the direct, raw precursor to the psychoactive THC that induces the altered states we discussed earlier.
Yes. When heat is applied, either through burning or the slow application of heat during an extraction, the THCA undergoes decarboxylation. It drops a carboxyl ring and becomes the highly active delta-9 THC.
So the presence of THCA synthase in the shaman's stash proved beyond any scientific doubt that this plant possessed the genetic hardware required to produce powerful, mind-altering effects.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
And the genetic capability of the plant was matched by the physical evidence of advanced cultivation techniques.
You mean how it was harvested?
Yes. The paleobotanist examining the 789 grams of material noted a profound absence of specific plant parts. The ancient cultivators had systematically and intentionally removed every single male plant from the harvest.
Because male cannabis plants produce pollen, but they do not produce the dense, resin-rich glandular trichomes found on the unpollinated female flowers.
Exactly. Furthermore, the researchers found that all the thick, low-THC stem and stalks had been carefully pruned away.
So the material in the wooden bowl consisted exclusively of the most highly potent components, the apical shoots, the resinous leaves, and the seeds.
Which demonstrates an incredibly sophisticated understanding of selective breeding and crop manicuring. The Gushi people, operating in 700 BCE, were cultivating and processing cannabis with the exact same precision and intent as a modern pharmaceutical botanist aiming to maximize psychoactive and medicinal yield.
That is it's mind-blowing. And this was not an isolated, anomalous find either, was it?
No, the Yanghai discovery is corroborated by subsequent excavations, such as the findings at the nearby Jiaohe Cemetery, where archaeologists uncovered 13 intact cannabis plants draped over burial.
13 whole plants.
Yes, and the morphological analysis of the flower heads in that grave again confirmed they were cultivated specifically for their resinous yield, not for bast fibers.
If a nomadic shaman in the desert and the continental wall both had this technology, does this imply a massive, ancient Eurasian trade network of psychoactive plants that predates the formal Silk Road?
It heavily implies exactly that. We are confronted with two distinct populations, separated about thousands of miles of brutal terrain. The continental Dongyi and Hua people in the east, providing hallucinogenic botanical tributes to Chinese emperors, and the Indo-European Gushi nomads in the western deserts, carefully manicuring high-THC cannabis for shamanic rituals.
So our concept of the Silk Road, which is typically dated to the Han Dynasty's formal trade routes expanding westward, is far too recent.
Far too recent. This shared botanical sophistication points to a massive, invisible, ancient Eurasian exchange network. A network where not just goods, but profound pharmacological knowledge, selective breeding techniques, and ritualistic applications of psychoactive plants flowed freely across the steppes.
Connecting the pastoral nomads of the West with the agrarian masters of the East centuries before formalized imperial trade.
Exactly. And as human civilization expanded and began to codify its empirical knowledge, this deep, profound understanding of cannabis did not remain confined to secret royal trances or desert shamanic burials.
It moved into the mainstream.
Yes. The application of the plant transitioned from mystical, unquantifiable possession into the structured realm of orthodox clinical medicine.
And we see this monumental shift documented during the later Han period, spanning roughly 25 to 220 CE, because it is during this era that cannabis is formally inscribed into China's oldest recognized pharmacopoeia.
The Shenong Bencao Jing, or the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica.
Right. And for those who might not know, a Materia Medica is the foundational text of any medical tradition. It categorizes hundreds of botanical, mineral, and zoological specimens, detailing their physiological effects, toxicities, and therapeutic applications.
And the inclusion of cannabis in this text is pivotal. It strips away the purely magical aura of the ChangCao tribute. The plant is evaluated and cataloged for its quantifiable clinical properties, recognizing its utility in treating specific physical ailments alongside its psychological effects.
Plus, the title of the text itself, the Shenong Bencao Jing, is a profound piece of historical connective tissue.
It really is. By attributing this vast encyclopedia of medical knowledge to Shenong, the legendary human sovereign and ancestor of the Dongyi, the later Han scholars were engaging in an act of profound cultural attribution.
They were formally acknowledging that the bedrock of their clinical science, the very foundation of their botanical mastery, was inherited from the Dongyi tradition.
It is a remarkable homage, yet it occurs against the backdrop of immense cultural tragedy.
Right, because while the botanical knowledge of the Dongyi was being meticulously preserved and codified in imperial texts, the physical and cultural survival of the Dongyi lineage on the continent was under severe threat.
The relentless cycle of those revolutions changing the mandate meant constant warfare, shifting borders, and the aggressive assimilation policies of dominant central powers.
So the original masters of this botanical knowledge recognized that their continued existence on the mainland was no longer tenable.
Faced with the prospect of total cultural erasure, the elites of the Dongyi lineage initiated a desperate and monumental migration.
So, what does this all mean? It's as if the greatest scientists and philosophers of an era saw their empire collapsing, so they backed up all their intellectual property, their agriculture, their medicine, and sailed across the ocean to reboot their society on a new island.
That is a perfect analogy. They consolidated their ancestral knowledge framework, traversed the treacherous waters of the East China Sea, and arrived on the Japanese archipelago.
And when these displaced elites arrived in the archipelago, they brought the physical manifestations of their culture with them. They brought advanced metallurgy, they brought wet rice agriculture, and crucially, they brought their botanical lineages.
They brought the cannabis plant. However, the integration of this plant into the nascent society they were building on the islands resulted in a profound functional evolution.
The application of cannabis shifted dramatically. I mean, on the continent, it had been the catalyst for intense internal chemical position. But in Japan,
In the Japanese archipelago, its primary use evolved away from ingestion and intoxication. It was elevated to become the ultimate physical manifestation of spiritual purity within Japan's indigenous belief system, Shinto.
which is such a massive shift. Shinto theology places paramount importance on the concepts of purity and defilement.
And cannabis, specifically the rough-woven hemp fiber, became the tangible instrument of that purity. The most striking example of this enduring sacred status is observed in the Daishosai.
The Daihosai, that's the great Thanksgiving festival, right?
Yes, it is the most secretive, esoteric, and sacred of the enthronement rituals for a new emperor of Japan. It is performed only once during an emperor's reign.
And the emperor enters a specially constructed temporary shrine complex at midnight to commune directly with Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and the imperial ancestors.
A strict, non-negotiable requirement for the execution of the Daishosai is the offering of a specialized fabric known as arati.
Arati is a coarse cloth woven entirely from hemp.
Exactly. The production of this fabric is so sacred that it is entrusted solely to a specific lineage, historically the Miki family of the Owa province, modern-day Tokushima. Without the presence of this specific cannabis fabric, the spiritual legitimization of the emperor cannot be completed.
Consider the immense historical continuity here. 3,000 years ago, the Zhou kings ingested the chemical essence of the plant to prove their divine mandate. Today, the Japanese emperor utilizes the woven physical structure of the exact same plant species to confirm his divine lineage.
The botanical tool remains identical. The methodology of interaction has simply been externalized.
And this externalization is visible throughout the archaeological and cultural record of Japan, too. The massive Kofun tumuli, the keyhole-shaped burial mounds of the early Japanese elite, have yielded remnants of cannabis fibers.
Echoing the grave goods of the Gobi shaman.
Exactly. Furthermore, the plant permeates the everyday tools of Shinto ritual. Within the precincts of any Shinto shrine, one encounters the shide.
The distinctive zigzag-shaped streamers hanging from the sacred Shimenawa ropes.
Right. And while modern iterations often utilize specialized paper, the original shide were constructed from bast hemp fibers or woven cannabis cloth.
Even more direct is the unusa. That's the wooden wand adorned with streamers that the Shinto priest waves over individuals and objects to cleanse them of spiritual defilement.
And the etymology of the implement reveals its origins. The kanji characters traditionally utilized to write unusa literally translate to great cannabis.
The physical act of purification, the sweeping away of impurities, is intrinsically linked to the spirit of the plant.
This sociological shift is fascinating, but wait. If they possessed the knowledge of its intense psychoactive properties from their ancestors, who understood the mechanics of the ethanol extraction and the liver metabolism, why did they shift to using it almost exclusively as a physical woven material for purification?
It's a great question. We must consider the immense sociological pressures of establishing a new, unified society in an unfamiliar geographical environment.
Was the chemical reality too dangerous for a stable society?
Precisely. Endorsing a ritual practice centered around profound, unpredictable, and highly individualized hallucinatory experiences introduces a massive variable of chemical chaos into a developing social order.
Because a society trying to establish a rigid agricultural calendar and strict social hierarchies cannot easily accommodate leaders or citizens routinely entering hours-long dissociative trances.
Exactly. By transitioning the application of cannabis from internal ingestion to external physical representation, the ruling class achieved a brilliant sociological compromise.
They maintain the sacred authority and the ancestral prestige of the plant, solidifying their historical connection to the Donji legacy, while simultaneously neutralizing the destabilizing psychological effects of mass intoxication.
The plant was integrated into the concept of hooray,
The daily practices of spatial and spiritual purification.
fostering communal order rather than individual possession.
So they successfully domesticated the magic. They took a wild, unpredictable pharmacological tool and wove it into the stabilizing fabric of organized religion.
They did. But knowledge regarding the absolute limits of human biology, the understanding of how a specific chemical compound can completely dismantle a human mind, rarely vanishes entirely.
No, it just submerges beneath the surface of Orthodox culture. Centuries later, during the brutal conflicts of Japan's feudal era, this suppressed chemical reality reemerged from the shadows, fully weaponized.
The documentation of this weaponization is found in one of the most remarkable texts of the Edo period, a comprehensive manual compiled in 1676 known as the Bansen Shukai.
Written by Fujibayashi Sabuji, the Bansen Shukai is effectively the master encyclopedia of ninjutsu.
It is a compilation of the deeply guarded strategies, covert philosophies, and practical espionage techniques utilized by the famous ninja clans of the Iga and Koku regions.
It covers everything from infiltration tactics and explosive formulations to the psychological manipulation of enemy targets. And hidden within the densely packed volumes detailing poisons and sleeping potions is a highly specific recipe for a concoction labeled ahoyaku.
Hohoyaku. The translation is blunt and chilling, fool's medicine.
And what's in it?
The primary active ingredient mandated for the creation of this fool's medicine is finely ground, dried cannabis leaf powder.
Just raw powder.
Yes. And the manual provides precise instructions for its administration. The operative is directed to covertly introduce the pulverized cannabis powder into the target's beverage, specifically suggesting it be dissolved and administered across 3 consecutive doses of thin heat.
Wow. The tactical scenario is insidious. A rival samurai or an enemy warlord sits down for a supposedly peaceful tea ceremony. Over the course of the ritual, they ingest 3 concentrated doses of raw, pulverized, psychoactive material.
We're looking at a massive, unregulated dose of oral cannabinoids passing directly into the gastrointestinal tract and hitting the liver.
First-pass metabolism again.
Exactly. And the Bansen Shukai describes the resulting physiological and psychological collapse with terrifying accuracy. The text notes that the target will lose their mind, descending into a state of profound cognitive paralysis.
They become an empty fool.
Stripped of their strategic awareness, their aggressive drive, and their ability to function within the rigid protocols of samurai society.
When analyzed through modern clinical toxicology, the ninja clans had essentially codified the exact symptoms of acute oral cannabinoid toxicity. They were weaponizing the extreme limits of the first-pass metabolism.
The massive influx of 11-hydroxy-THC into the central nervous system induces overwhelming dissociation, severe ataxia or loss of motor coordination, crippling lethargy, and dense anterior-grade amnesia.
The target is entirely neutralized as a military or political threat without a single blade being drawn.
The profound irony of the ahoyaku recipe is that it is the exact same biochemical mechanism utilized by the ancient Zhou kings.
Right. The kings utilized the 11-hydroxy-THC trance to elevate themselves to the status of deities. Thousands of years later, the covert operatives of Iga and Koka utilized that identical metabolic pathway to drag their enemies down into the state of an empty fool.
The chemical key is identical. The resulting reality is entirely dependent on the intent of the hand pouring the tea.
It is a stark reminder of the dual nature inherent in all pharmacological knowledge. While the covert clans were exploiting the extreme toxicological limits of the plant in the shadows, the orthodox medical establishment in Japan continued to refine its clinical therapeutic applications.
Maintaining a direct lineage back to the methodologies outlined in the Shinanben Kao Jing, the clinical utilization of the plant remained highly active.
During the Edo period, a prominent and highly respected naturalist and physician named Ikiken Kaibara compiled a monumental text known as the Yamato Hanzo, or the Japanese Materia Medica.
And in this comprehensive encyclopedia of native flora and fauna, Kaibara documented cannabis not as an instrument of espionage, nor strictly as a sacred Shinto textile,
but as a vital, highly effective clinical treatment for infectious disease. Specifically, he documented the use of cannabis in the treatment of malaria.
Malaria induces a brutal cycle of physiological trauma, characterized by severe racking chills, intense muscular spasms, and dangerous spikes in body temperature.
And Kaibara's clinical observations noted the profound efficacy of cannabis in mitigating these specific symptoms. The botanical compounds interact heavily with the human endocannabinoid system, which plays a critical role in thermoregulation and the management of muscular spasticity.
By administering cannabis, Edo period physicians were effectively utilizing its properties as a potent antispasmodic and antipyretic.
Suppressing the violent shivering and helping to regulate the malarial fevers.
And Kaibara was acutely aware of the deep historical roots of the treatments he was prescribing. Within the Yamato Hanzo, he explicitly noted that ancient Japanese histories recorded the planting and utilization of cannabis since the very beginning of human time on the islands.
Consciously tying his contemporary medical observations back to the ancestral legacy of the Donji agriculturalists.
The orthodox medical journey of this plant did not conclude in the Edo period either.
No, the empirical observations of Ikikin Kaibara transitioned seamlessly into the rigid, legally codified standards of modern medicine. We only have to examine the official Japanese pharmacopoeia.
The comprehensive, legally binding compendium of standards for all medical drugs, diagnostic tools, and pharmaceutical preparations utilized in the country.
From its initial publication in the year 1886, extending all the way through the turbulent early half of the 20th century until 1951, the Japanese pharmacopoeia maintained a prominent official listing for the Indian cannabis plant.
1951. We are well into the modern post-World War II era, and cannabis is still officially categorized and utilized by modern physicians.
The pharmacological categorization during this period is incredibly specific, isn't it?
It was officially prescribed and legally dispensed as a potent sedative and a hypnotic. In pharmacological terms, a hypnotic is a compound utilized specifically to induce sleep and combat severe insomnia.
So for patients suffering from profound anxiety, restlessness, or neuralgic pain that prevented rest, early 20th century Japanese doctors would prescribe highly measured, standardized tinctures of cannabis.
The active cannabinoids would bind to the CB1 receptors, depressing the central nervous system, mitigating the sensory input of pain, and inducing a deep, restorative, hypnotic sleep state.
It's incredible. The exact same chemical reaction, 11-hydroxy-THC, metabolizing in the liver, was used to justify ancient kingship, to silently neutralize enemies in feudal Japan, and finally, to help modern patients get a good night's sleep. The modern physician was wielding the exact same receptor-binding mechanics as the Gobi shaman, simply calibrated for rest rather than revelation.
The overarching narrative of this single botanical species forces a radical reassessment of human ingenuity and the development of early science.
We really do suffer from a severe chronological chauvinism, assuming that ancient populations were merely stumbling in the dark, waiting for the advent of the modern laboratory to understand their environment.
The evidence dictates otherwise. The continental Donji, the isolated Gushi shamans, the compiling scholars of the later Han, they were absolute masters of their ecological reality.
Through rigorous observation, intergenerational data collection, and empirical trial and error, they successfully mapped the complex chemical pathways of the human central nervous system.
They identified the precise enzymes necessary for cycle activity, engineered the organic solvents required for extraction, and utilized those biological discoveries to literally construct the religious and political frameworks of empires. To trace the complete history of cannabis sativa across the Eurasian continent is not merely to track the spread of an agricultural commodity.
It is an exploration into the history of human consciousness itself. The journey of this plant mirrors humanity's profound, desperate, and enduring drive to alter our internal reality.
Whether the goal is to ascend to the realm of the divine, to psychologically dismantle our geopolitical rivals, or simply to alleviate the physical suffering of a malarial fever.
We have mapped an astonishing botanical arc today. A single plant bridges the heavily guarded, incense-filled courts of the Zhou dynasty in 1000 BCE, the freezing, wind-scoured burial mounds of a blue-eyed nomad on the prehistoric Silk Road, the pristine midnight purification rituals of the Japanese emperor, the silent, terrifying assassinations orchestrated by feudal ninja clans, and the sterile, precise measurements of a 20th century modern pharmacy.
The physical application shifted from the internal biochemistry of the liver to the external weave of a sacred cloth, but the underlying recognition of the plant's immense world-altering power remained a constant absolute across 3 millennia.
It fundamentally changes how you look at the mundane details of history. And to you, listening right now, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you step back into your daily routine.
That's a big one.
The sources we explored today show how profoundly one plant shaped human power and spirituality over millennia. It makes you wonder what other foundational aspects of our modern medical or spiritual lives, things we take completely for granted, are actually the faint, echoing remnants of forgotten magical rituals from thousands of years ago.
We navigate a world built entirely upon the ghosts of ancient botanical mastery. We only need the right historical lens to recognize the architecture they left behind.
At the beginning of our deep dive, we questioned the utility of viewing history strictly as an X-ray, a black and white film showing only the rigid, broken bones of dates and conquests.
Right.
The journey of the ChangCao proves that history is not an X-ray. It is an intricate, functional MRI of the human mind, lighting up in vivid, psychoactive colors, revealing not just the geographical coordinates of where our ancestors lived, but the profound, complex chemistry of how they dreamed, how they exerted absolute power, and how they ultimately survived. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history behind the everyday world, and we will see you next time.